Welcome to the DRF Sports Podcast, brought to you by DRF Sports. America's most trusted name in horse racing is now providing sports bettors with exclusive data, analytics, previews, videos, and expert picks on all major sports. Bet smarter and have more fun doing it. It's the DRF Sports Podcast, and now your host, Sheldon Alexander. Ready, set, bet.
This is the DRF Sports Podcast, episode 70. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander, and we're coming off a Monday pod in which we went 3-4 against the spread, but we're still kicking at 22-15 overall in the play-in/playoffs. Combine that with a 34-19-1 record overall for the NBA picks. Things are still rolling. More on that in a sec, but first, be a pro and win. Introducing DRF Sports' all-new premium data feature on drfs.com/sports. For $99 a year, which is just $8.25 a month, you can get industry-leading betting trends, angles, and analytics. With so many big sporting events here, it's the best way for you to make some money this postseason and have fun while doing it. That's DRF Sports Pro. Sign up now at drf.com/sports. And it is a big time of the year. There's NBA playoffs going on. We got the NBA draft going on Thursday night. So much to talk about, so much value in terms of how you can make some money. And we're here to help you do that. So my guy, Matt Russell, will join us here on the pod to break down where, again, the NBA playoffs have been, where they are now, and where they're going, and also give you some insight on the NFL draft. And luckily for y'all, that starts right about now. And the NBA playoffs continues, and we'll give a little update here on the picks before we start here. Monday's pod, I'm just gonna say this right off the front end, a 3-4 performance for me on Monday's pod. There was another game, including the Miami Heat -7. Obviously, things change when they decide, you know what, we don't even care about this game that much. We're not even going to play Jimmy Butler. I've read that headline like 3 times over. Like, I'm watching the game and I saw Butler on the bench. And I was like, wait a second, he's in street clothes. Like, how did he not play? What's going on? Anyways, we're back to recap and go through what's going on in the NBA, but I always like to give the record, so let's do this. I went 3-4 on Monday's pod, bringing the totals to 22-15 in the play-in and playoffs, 34-19-1 against the spread overall. And we're still keeping things moving as the NBA playoffs continues to move, and the first round is about over. And what a ride it's been so far. And along this journey with us here on the DRF Sports Podcast, once again, is our guy, Mr. Matt Russell. How has the first round been going for you as we're kind of halfway through all the games being done, or all the first round series being over?
Yeah, it's the transition period, right? Where we're still kind of digging into these end series, and then we've got new series. We're just looking before the podcast started at odds for Boston and Milwaukee. So it's like, okay, like I'm trying to figure out what's going on with these series still. Like there's still so much up in the air. Meanwhile, the NBA, right? They'll throw a game 1 and a game 7, like basically back to back. They'll even throw the game 7 on after a game 1 on a Sunday, something along those lines. So yeah, I mean, listen, and 3-4, whatever, like that's not that big of a deal, especially when you're hitting 59% on the playoffs. So I wouldn't beat yourself up too much. On our side of things over here, a lot of series prices coming in. We'll talk about some of the series that have gone by. We don't need to sort of beat them to death necessarily, but like Milwaukee last night and the Warriors last night, both coming through with victories. One of them considerably easier than the other, but both end up cashing not that we had series prices on that many. So I would say the rare series price that we had. So it was kind of fun that both of those cashed on the same night. So nice to wake up and seeing a little boost to the old bankroll as you check the accounts in the morning after a couple of series closures like that last night.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of series closers, we started most of the pods that we've done so far for the playoffs with the Celtics and Nets series. And now that is obviously over. The Celtics win the series 4-0, and they win game 4, 116-112, covering the -1 spread on the road. And it's a wrap. We've discussed it. Everything played out kind of exactly how we laid out as the games went along. And, for me, it was an interesting series in the sense that, like, you watch these games and you come into the series with your opinion, and you watch the games and you adjust, much like the coaches and players adjust throughout the series. Yeah. And I mean, that took a turn, but I just, as we watched it play out from like game 2, it was just like, oh, this is a problem for the Nets. And so sort of the same way things played out as that series wraps up for the Celtics, they will now go forward to face the Milwaukee Bucks, as you mentioned, and the Bucks win and cover. They win their series 4-1. They cover the -10 for us very easily. So a good little 2-0 wrap for us there in those two picks, but 116-100. And I mean, easy cover for the Bucks. Weird series for the Bulls as they dealt with injuries. They dealt with the one great DeMar DeRozan game and then the normal DeMar DeRozan playoff games, I'll say, as someone who followed a lot of his career. But in terms of those two series wrapping up, and now we look ahead to the Celtics and Bucks series, which will start on Sunday, Boston is favored by 5 points. I'll say this much. Mm-hmm. My angle going into this series is I'm strictly going game to game because I need to see what happens with Chris Middleton. Right. So that's kind of my angle going here. And in a game 1 at home for Boston, -5 is a lot. And I don't really like laying that many points, but I'm going to take the Celtics just because I'm seeing what they've done. I'm going to trust the defense down the stretch and the defense that they'll be able to stop Pat Connaughton, Grayson Allen, like the others, right? Yeah. That have been able to do a lot of the damage for the Bucks in their earlier series against the Bulls. So I'm on Celtics -5 heading into game 1, but how does that play out in your mind in terms of not only the series, but what we just witnessed with their series wins?
Yeah. So a couple of different things. I mean, one, I understand the pricing and the series price -175 for the Celtics. Like, that all makes sense. They've got the home court advantage in a series that by and large, I think is, when you see the -5 for the home team, right? Like, that's not that far off from where we talk about how, if these teams were dead equal, we would go -3 to -3.5 on either side, whoever was the home team, right? If this was just literally two identical teams, one team's playing at home, you make them a -3, 3.5 point favorite, right? So Boston gets a little bit more credit here because of what they've done. And obviously the Chris Middleton injury. And we talked about, okay, well, what difference does Chris Middleton make? And it's, he makes a difference covering a big number. He makes a difference playing a really good team. He doesn't necessarily make a difference in whether or not you beat the Bulls, right? Just needing to win outright as they did in those games 3 and 4. And so, okay, I would expect Middleton to have a point spread effect, right? Whether it's 1, 2, 3 points, something along those lines. We'll talk about what different players mean to the point spread and some of these other matchups that are still going on in the first round. And so I just go, well, is Middleton being factored in enough here? Because again, if this was an even sort of series, then the Celtics would probably be about a 3.5 point favorite because the home court advantage very real for the Celtics. I would be open to listening to you tell me that they should be 4 point, have a 4 point home court advantage, right? Which is sort of on the top end of home court advantage, factors, if you will. And so if that's the case, then you're trying to tell me here with this -5 that the Celtics are only 1 point better right now than the Bucks. And I would have a hard time believing that. Right. And so whether it's, 3.5 or 4 for home court or 1.5 for Middleton being out, or just even if Middleton was in, there's a decent chance that the Celtics are better than the Bucks right now anyway. Right. And so the Celtics, the impressive thing is, right, like being not afraid of the Nets and being able to sort of, play at the end there to get that second seed now gets them the home court. And this was the gamble that they made. Right. They made the gamble. Okay, we'll play the Nets instead of the Bulls, and we won't throw these games down the stretch, even though there were points where maybe we thought they might be. I think a very specific game in Milwaukee in that last week where they had a couple of their guys sitting out. And so, we'll dig into the matchup. And I think you're probably right as far as playing these on a game to game basis because, yeah, -175. I'm not saying it's high necessarily, but it's not something I'm dying to lay against a team, literally the defending champions here. So I'm not going to play this in any sort of series type of way. I think you're right about playing it game to game. I certainly have no problem with Boston -5. Now, the total a little bit interesting here as well. Now, we just had this Brooklyn and Boston series that I would have liked to see have gone longer, because we would have gotten more chances to be profitable by betting the under. Now, the under actually went 2-2 in those games. And so, I feel like the first time, first game it went over, and it was sort of like a lot of fouls, especially early on, right? And the referees kind of carried that over. And then the next two games were under, and then the fourth game was over, I believe. And so, I kind of felt like that should have been 3-1 to the under, but it was 2-2. And if they had played a 7-game series, as we all, put the paperwork in after game one to sign up for 7 games, if that had been a 7-game series, we might have had a 5-2, or at the, I think the very least a 4-3 record to the under. So I look at the total here, and it's 218. And I go, okay, what difference are we going to have here from Boston? Because Boston is the pace setter, right? They are the defense that's going to hold this down. And so the under becomes interesting to me again, especially on the road for Milwaukee. Now, at home for Milwaukee, little bit of a different story, right? The shooting's going to be a little bit better. That's just kind of how it works. We always talk about the other guys, right? The supporting cast. Your guy, Charles Barkley, might call them the bus riders, right? The guys at the back of the bus who chip in from time to time. Those guys are going to be more effective on home court. And so -5, I like. Kind of like the under here at 218, right? This is something that, again, I could see being just over 200 in a total score type of a situation here. So that's where I'm looking at it. Obviously, Milwaukee, I joked about it on Twitter and on this podcast after the Bulls won game 2, where our -2.5, right? Needing the Bucks to win 4-1 or in a sweep was very much in doubt when you're losing home games, right? But that's the Bucks. They sort of take it easy in the first 2 games, right? They did it against the Celtics last year. And so, and in previous years to that. So I go, okay, like if I know I'm not going to get peak Milwaukee in the first game, and I don't know if there's anything other than peak Celtics right now. Now, and they need that, right? Because listen, going into this season, people weren't exactly like trampling over themselves to bet on the Celtics. You and I had this conversation back in February after they'd gone on this run. And I was like, this is actually a really interesting team. And so now we're starting to really respect what the Celtics do. But a lot of that is because they're bringing their A game 100% of the time, or very near it, right? And so I expect that more than I would necessarily Milwaukee, who tends to sort of pack it in some of these early games in series. So I'm right there with you. I'm happy we've cashed our Milwaukee. We basically ended up drinking the juice in that Brooklyn Boston series, going 2-2 on those unders. And I personally had Brooklyn in game 3, but we did have the Celtics in game 4. So we end up splitting all of those bets. So we end up down 0.3, 0.4 units in that series, but made up for it in the Milwaukee series, being able to score those 2 early Bulls +10s, and then avoiding the games the rest of the way in that series and cashing with the -2.5, even though it was a bit of a sweat. So we end up 3 units on that. So we're, 2.5 on these from an accounting standpoint, we're in the pluses for those 2 series. So again, now that we're looking forward to this, I'm not looking to grab the series price necessarily. I am going to play this game to game with you here. I'll be on the Celtics as well at -5, and at 218, I'm looking at the under here as well.
Yeah, definitely looking at the unders. I'm not an over under better, so to speak, but I watch a lot of basketball, and the prediction here is that this will be that slow down, grind out, half court. Like the Celtics, I'm interested to see how it's reffed to start off as well, because the Celtics are going to try to rough up Giannis, body Giannis, and you're going to see a lot of that in this series. And I'm interested to see, because I think it'll just be that slow down, half court. You're going to see games in the 90s. Like I that's my viewpoint on that. So, good old playoff basketball for the old heads, I'll say. But if we go to, sorry.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, if you can do it to Kevin Durant, right? If you can swarm him the way that they did, right? And make him make decisions that aren't just in the flow and being able to just hit shots, you can do that to Giannis, right? You're going to have the ball out of his hands, and who is going to beat you if it's not Giannis, right? They will have the plan, right? The old Nick Nurse, put the wall up type deal for Giannis. honest.
Yeah.
Now, again, his game is improved to the point where he, can beat that. But over the course of 7 games, that's going to be a really taxing situation for him, especially if you don't have the shooting from Chris Middleton out there.
For sure. Yeah. Having Chris Middleton turn into Grayson Allen is a bit of a difference. And I'm not slandering Grayson Allen. I know it sounds like that, but it's just the reality of the situation, right? Like the guys that they're relying on, they need to hit a lot of shots. I'd rather bet on the Celtics, at least for game 1. So we move on and we got the Heat and Hawks. That series is done as Miami wins 3-1. As mentioned on the pod, I gave out -7 for the Heat, and then Jimmy Butler doesn't play. Heat end up winning the game anyways without Kyle Lowry and without Jimmy Butler. They win 97-94, and they will move on to play the winner of the Raptors and Sixers series. And I mean, from a Raptor standpoint, a lot of storylines there. And from the Sixers standpoint, I mean, there's becoming a lot of storylines there as well. The Sixers lead the series 3-2, but the Raps are on the comeback trail here as they win game 5 in Philadelphia in a blowout, 103-88. I was on the Sixers, and watching that game, I'll say this, that looks like a team that is ready to blow it. They did not come out with any type of intensity, with any type of team with urgency at all. Like it's like they thought, okay, Fred VanVleet's out, the Raps are just going to roll over. Like, I don't know what their game plan was, or what Doc's speech was, or what Embiid's speech was, or what James Harden's doing. That just looked like a team that is ready to blow it. And as you head into a game 6 Thursday night, Philly is favored by -1.5 in Toronto. And I have no idea how I could possibly say that I'm going to be on the Philadelphia 76ers on the road in Toronto after watching what they just did at home. Like, I would be stunned. And this is not to say that Philly can't win. I'm just telling you, I'd be stunned if Philadelphia won this game tonight. So of course I got to be on the Raps in this game. Like, that's just my eyes. And maybe I'm overreacting to what I just saw, but I'm okay to take that L if the Sixers win in game 6 in Toronto. I will tip my cap to Joel Embiid and company.
Yeah. I mean, that's fair, but listen, we finally got you, right? We finally got the crown prince of Raptors Twitter and Raptors post-game podcasts and whatnot.
Yes.
We finally got you to believe, right? Because you'll recall your boy over here was on the Raptors in game 4. Your boy over here was on Raptors in game 5. We hopped in the time machine, right? We hopped in the time machine to grab all of our profits from game 4 and throw them on the Raptors, 17-1, 22-1 that were out there to win this series. Now, again, we haven't actually won that bet yet, right? But we, as you mentioned, it's really hard to imagine that the Raptors don't win this game tonight. And the hard part, if you will, was winning that game 5 because, listen, a couple of things before the series started. We needed the Raptors to win a game in Philadelphia. Right. So the idea okay, home court advantage for Philadelphia is going to make it impossible for the Raptors to win. That goes against where our belief was before the series started. So we would have liked them to take one of 2, initially. And unfortunately, because they lost in game 3 in that catastrophe, it meant that they have to now win 2 road games. But the other element was we want this series to go as long as possible because the longer it goes, a couple of different things happens. One, Nick Nurse gets to do his magic over Glenn Rivers, PhD. And then the other thing is, obviously, it's Joel Embiid, right? And whether it's an injury or whether it's exhaustion and having to deal with the Raptors and their defense over the course of 7 games, right? The longer the series goes, the better the better the Raptors have a chance to, I don't think that's even a sentence, the better chance the Raptors have to befuddle Embiid, right? To be a problem for him. James Harden, right? You and I have been seeing through this all along. But the interesting thing to me here, and when we talk about this going, okay, well, what has changed from game to game or sort of the evolution of this series? And to me, you mentioned Fred VanVleet. And it's funny, right? Because we talk about a Trae Young, for example, and there being a bad matchup for a guy like him in that Miami series, right? And you go, okay, they're going to have a real problem here because of the perimeter defenders that the Heat can throw out. This is almost a bad matchup for Fred VanVleet in this series, I'm thinking. And this sort of forced adjustment that they have to have without Van Fleet is actually working to the benefit. Now, part of that is Scotty Barnes gets to actually play after not playing in basically 2.5 games in this series. And so you have, the reason they drafted Scotty Barnes was like, okay, this guy can play center, this guy can play point guard and everywhere in between. And now they get to use him sort of full time here with Van Fleet being out. Now, he would be important in a series against Miami, for example, or whatever, but he's actually kind of expendable here. And I'm going to explain why. Because as much as we look at Embiid and we go, okay, like he's dominant, blah, 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 when healthy, all of that sort of thing. And James Harden gets all of the attention. And of course, we all worry about Thibault and like him, he's in the lineup, he's not in the lineup. And Tobias Harris, every once in a while, he shows up. To me, the player that makes the Sixers dangerous, that makes them a good team is Tyrese Maxey. And you saw that in game 1 where he throws down a 38-point performance, 23 in game 2. And you go, okay, if you're going to get 38 from Maxey and you're going to get 23, you're like, this is just going to be, ball game here, right? Like there's only so much the Raptors can do if the supporting cast, the bus passengers, if you will, are doing that type of work out there. And so when you're Nick Nurse, you have to sit back and you go, okay, what do we do about the Maxey issue? And it's not necessarily about defending him. What do you do at any point when a guy is beating you on offense, Shall? You make him play defense, right? You try to tire him out on the other end of the court. And so what they've done here is, because Van Fleet isn't able to play, they have no choice but to put all of the 6'8" guys out on the court at the same time. It's like almost stumbling into a successful 5-man unit. Now it's a 5-man unit that has, because the Raptors are so deep from that standpoint, has 6, 7, even 8 guys that they can sort of rotate through. And what that happens, 2 things. Well, one, defensively, that length is just, and it was always going to be a problem for everybody other than Joel Embiid. Now, Embiid ends up, whether you want to call him 90%, 80% of himself, whatever, he can't shoot from distance. So, and the Raptors know that, and they know that he has to drive, which makes things even a little bit easier for them defensively. Or the fact that, they figured out how to guard Harden, right? They realize, I think they literally do in the drills where, your coach would force your hands behind your back. Everybody would have their hands tied behind their back and it would force you to play with your feet and play with your chest. That's what they're doing with Harden, right? They're allowing him to come in. They refuse to foul him, right? And they're going to make him make these off balance layups and floaters and all of that sort of James Harden stuff that a lot of the time he's going to miss because he's going to get fouled and he's going to accumulate all kinds of points at the free throw line. But the big thing on offense for the Raptors is they just search out whoever Maxey is guarding, because he at 6'3", 6'4" is going to have trouble against anyone on the court, and it doesn't matter who. And so you see Siakam get the ball at the top of the key, and you're like, man, Siakam's like essentially kind of starting the offense from the top of the key. And it's like, yeah, because they can just point out, okay, boom, who is it? Is it Precious who's getting guarded by Maxey? Is it Barnes who's getting guarded by Maxey? And they do one of 2 things. They either just throw a lob up to whomever Maxey's guarding, because that player can be in the middle of the key, or they just put him in a ball screen and they switch him. And now you have a 6'8", 6'9", 6'10" guy, or in the case of Siakam, basically an all NBA player going up against a guard. And so that takes out this whole like Thibault defensive stopper like type of thing, where it's like, it doesn't matter, because Thibault's just going to stand there guarding somebody else while we put Maxey in one-on-one situations against guys who are much taller than him, right? And again, whether that's a lob situation down low or in a ball screen. And the thing is, like, what's going to change about that? Nothing, right? The Sixers are just going to take Maxey out of the game and put who in? Because this team isn't deep at all, especially in Toronto when Thibault doesn't get to play. Now, speaking of which, like, where was he in game 5, right? 14 minutes, 2 points. Like, I'm not exactly shaking in my boots here when Thibault's out on the court, because again, offensively, the Raptors have figured out a way around what the Sixers do well. And they're basically on defense just saying, okay, like, we don't have a big guy. We don't have, the Marc Gasols of the world to guard Joel Embiid. But you know what? We're going to take our chances that a hampered Joel Embiid, however injured he actually is, isn't going to score 40 isn't going to score 50 and carry this team. Like, good for him and kudos to him for playing through whatever injury he has. But 25 points, when you look around at the rest of the lineup with a basically borderline on his way to being washed up James Harden and a Tyrese Maxey who's getting like, what's the shooting percentage that Maxey would have to have that's going to outweigh the liability that he is defensively? Right? Like, that doesn't exist. He's giving up a ton of points per possession when he is getting involved defensively, which the Raptors are slowing the game down. They can literally watch them. They'll get the ball over half court. They'll pass it mostly to Siakam, but also to Barnes, and they'll stop everything. And they'll go, okay, where is Maxey? Right. And they literally say like, okay, everybody organize. Right. And that's why these unders, I think, are also an interesting bet in these series. But honestly, we're so deep into the weeds far as the Raptors coming back to at least force a game 7. I'll obviously evaluate that, maybe take some money off my position of this Raptors team at 22-1, and having rolled over the winnings from game 4. I'll take, I'll step back, but like, what's the point spread going to be in that game 7, right? And again, we're not going to have a conversation about this, about a game 7, because it's going to happen this weekend. Again, knock on wood that the Raptors actually win this game tonight. But like, what could that possibly be? Because it's not going to be 8 anymore, right? We talked about it on Monday. That 8 number was just like the craziest number ever, right? That was Joel Embiid healthy, like all of this other stuff type of a number. Because I'm just looking at this, I'm like, the first guy off the bench is George Niang. All right. And I'm like, I'm not worried about George Niang, right? And if we can close out here on Danny Green 3-pointers, who seems like he's the only guy somewhat dangerous from the perimeter. Again, like, what's Glenn Rivers going to do? Right? Is he going to go zone and dare the Raptors to beat him that way? Like, I don't know that you can go 48 minutes of zone against a team in the NBA these days. So, what's the line going to be? Is it going to be back to the 4.5 that it was in game 1? Because to me, that's where it kind of has to be, because 8 and 7.5 and all of this stuff just doesn't make any sense to me at all. And so I don't even really understand necessarily why the Raptors aren't favored in this game. Like, I think to me, that's just complete ignorance of what has happened throughout this season from an adjustment standpoint on these coaching staffs. And you mentioned Doc Rivers making comments, right? It's the same thing as Joel Embiid talking about how Nick Nurse needs to stop complaining about the officiating, and then immediately in the next game starts complaining about the officiating. It's the first sign of panic. And Nick Nurse had every right to be panicked because, 1, the officiating was a farce in those first 2 games. And 2, without Scotty Barnes being the key piece in all of this, right? A guy who can handle the ball well enough to play point guard in this lineup. Like, yeah, I'd be panicked too if I was Nick Nurse after game 2. But I would be panicked right now if I was Glenn Rivers, PhD, after game 5, because I think you're right. I think the Raptors are going to win this series.
Yeah, I mean, listen, if this gets to game 7, I have no idea what's going to happen in a game 7, just based off of, again, we have NBA referees in a Philly home crowd in a game 7 with, yeah, anyways, I'm not even going to go that far down that lane. But my point being, like, this game right now, I just can't see the Sixers winning that game. And then the other part is going into a game 7, the Sixers, they're already tight. You could see that in a game 5. In terms of this actual game though, the couple things benefiting the Raptors was they played Philly late in the season twice without Fred VanVleet, who, there's a lot of slander. And even in like Raptors Twitter world, there's a lot of talk about, oh, Fred was playing so bad anyways. It's like, Fred's been hurt since the All-Star break. Right. And so like, he's been trying to play, but he's been hobbled and not playing as well. So yes, the matchup against Fred VanVleet in this series is bad, but even worse is the matchup against a hobbled Fred VanVleet. And so him trying to like tough it out,
sure,
right, was just a liability on the floor before he was able to not walk. Because Maxey, like, Fred VanVleet's a good on-ball defender. He can guard Maxey straight up, whatever, but hobbled, no chance. Sure. And we saw that in the first couple of games, right? So you remove that, you get Scotty Barnes back, and the Raps are used to playing that way. Why? Because again, Fred VanVleet missed a bunch of games down the stretch. Yeah. So that's a thing that definitely helps the Raps. In terms of the Sixers, I mean, Doc Rivers, we know there's not going to be a lot of adjustments, and you just watch that game 5 and there's a lot of just standing around. And I mean, I get what Joel Embiid's skill set is, and I'm definitely going to sound like the old man, get off my lawn here, but like, the biggest guy on the floor by a lot I'm not giving him the ball at the top of the key at the 3-point line every time down the floor and having the 4 other guys stand around and just watch him. Like those were their plays. It just made no sense to me. So I don't know what the adjustment's going to be if you're Doc, but his clips tell me that he is already nervous when you're bringing up your Orlando Magic team and what that roster was. Joel Embiid talking about how, it's not my job to tell James Harden he needs to shoot more. That's on the coach. Like I've told him that already. The way the Sixers win this game, it's the only way they win is if the refs come out and do what the refs do, which doesn't really make sense for them on the road. But if Joel Embiid or James Harden come out and just have like the performance that on paper you would expect them to have. I'm not saying in reality, I'm saying on paper that we're told these guys are superstars. Your superstars come out and win you road games in the playoffs. And that's the only way I see the Sixers winning this game 6. And I'm talking like monster Joel Embiid turning into, I always like to say 2000 Shaq 40 and 20 type stat line. Only way I see the Sixers winning. And there's nothing to show me that that's a thing.
Yeah, and a non-mangled hand, Joel Embiid could do that, right? But like, again, whether it's Nick Nurse making a figurative bet or us making a literal bet, like we all will collectively bet against that with his hand, right? And you can, if Doc Rivers wants to put him up at the top of the key, knowing that the Raptors know that they are completely fine with him just taking outside shots with a mangled hand, right? Like, again, it's impressive that Embiid can even get 20 points with the Raptors knowing everything that they need, that they know about Embiid and where he is, right? And like
he said that as well, right? He's said in the presser, he's like, with the way that they're playing me, like James has to shoot more, right? And it's just a weird thing to see. And Doc Rivers, of all the coaches you could possibly have to think about what the adjustment could be, I mean, I would actually consider playing a lot more zone and forcing the Raptors because they will fall into that trap where they just settle for a lot of threes and they're not actually like that good of a 3-point shooting team.
Sure.
You know what I mean? So like, it's an interesting thing. And I'm saying and especially without Fred VanVleet, who's probably their best 3-point shooter, but it's just a weird thing for me. If I look at that and it just takes a lot of adjustments. It's going to be, you know what it is for the Sixers to win this game in Toronto. It's going to have to be a lot of things counter to everything that we've seen before from Doc, from James Harden and Joel Embiid. And like, I don't know. That Raptors crowd is going to be insane too. Like that's
for sure. Well, so here's the thing, you and I talked about it with Bill Self, right? Bill Self wins the 2nd national title and it's like, he's, ready for the Mount Rushmore or whatever. And you go like, man, I didn't even really love how he coached in that championship game. And we referred to like Andy Reid, who wins a Super Bowl and all of a sudden, like he gets sort of carte blanche to do whatever he wants for the next few years. And we forget about the 20 years before that. Like Glenn Rivers is absolutely that dude, right? Like did not, he references the Magic teams, right? And it was like always underperforming with the Tracy McGrady's of the world, right? And he goes to Boston and I'll never forget, right? Like Bill Simmons, obviously noted Boston super fan, right? Would always make fun of Doc Rivers. And then all of a sudden he gets Ray Allen, Kevin Garnett, and Paul Pierce together, right? And then they win the title. And now like Glenn Rivers basically gets to write a ticket to wherever he wants to go, where at the start of the postseason, people were talking about him going to the Lakers, right? Like the Lakers were going to pry him out of Philadelphia. Well, the other stuff, the other element to this is whether it's the fans in Philadelphia or again, the quotes that are coming out of the locker room, Glenn Rivers is out of there, right? Like he is going to get ridden out by a rail, even if they end up winning this series, because the reality is probably going to lose the next one against the Heat, right? And so if the players don't even really think that this guy is going to be around, like that's not really a great sign either when it comes to Philadelphia's chances. So he's getting, again, we're at over a decade of credit for winning with the Celtics team that was loaded, that was put together for the purposes of winning a championship.
And they only got one.
And by the way, yes, they only did get one, right? Which you could make the case is an underperformance over the course of his tenure. So, we don't even have to get into the Clippers tenure. So yeah, just wild to me here. But I listen, and then if the Raptors can pull this off and we end up cashing, what is effectively a 22-1 bet, I don't care what happens the rest of this NBA playoffs, right? Because we'll be sitting really pretty for on the ledger, so to speak.
Yeah, again, like I'll be like completely stunned if somehow, I was about to call them the Clippers because I mean I guess it's essentially the same scenario. Yeah. I'll be super stunned if the Sixers figure out a way to win this game on Thursday night. But to the Western Conference, where there are no Clippers because they didn't make it, we got the Nuggets and Warriors. Warriors win that series 4-1. They win in game 5, 102-98. They do not cover the 9-point spread, but that's okay. Only series in the West that is done. The Warriors will play the winner of Minnesota and Memphis. Speaking of Minnesota and Memphis, that series is now at 3-2. And that's off a win, which was a crazy game 5. Can't even like emphasize that enough. I don't have enough crazies to emphasize how insane that game was. But 111 to 109, they did not cover the 6-point spread. I was on Memphis in that game, but it's okay. The lesson here though was the initial take from the start of the series, right? It was like Minnesota can keep this game spicy. And the one thing that's funny is they've definitely kept this series spicy. The weirdest part to me is that they could be winning this series and probably could have won this series if Minnesota had any type of discipline at all. But either way, that brings us to game 6, which is Friday in Memphis. Grizzlies favored by 1. And I think I'm going, that has to be in Minnesota, right? Yeah, game 6 is in Minnesota. My bad. But the Grizzlies are favored by 1 in Minnesota, and I think they end it. I mean, I'm going to go with Memphis here at the -1. I just think Minnesota's had enough of their chances, and I can't take them to cover 1 point when all I've seen them do is just blow leads in this entire series.
Right. Yeah. And listen, this is why, I shouldn't say this is why, as if we knew this, was that predictable, but, we had over 5.5 total games, right? So we end up getting there when that series went 2-2. And then we grabbed the Grizzlies series price after they lost game 1. Why did we do that? Because of the shot quality numbers, right? And it won't always sort of lead you to a bet. There was, the Warriors game last night that you referenced. Shout out to them for closing that out. We talked about needing them to close it out as soon as possible, betting the -1.5 at even money and the -2.5 at +190. So we end up throwing another 3.9 units from that series. Remember we were on the Warriors in game 1 as the only bet for the game to game there. So, now we're up over 6 units for the 3 series that are done, just, getting the accounting out of the way. But yeah, point is with the Grizzlies and the Timberwolves, we've cashed that. We grabbed the Memphis series price after they lost because of the shot quality numbers. And it happened again, but this time at least they didn't lose the game. All 3 games in Memphis, 90% or better win probability based on the shot quality numbers, right? The Memphis Grizzlies are just not making shots in order to cover some of these numbers, or obviously in the case of game 1, win the game at all. Now, good news is losing that game 1 led us to the bet on the Grizzlies series price, and we are now sitting quite pretty on that. The series price for Memphis, of course, is -650, with them just needing to win one of the next 2 games and having that cushion of a game 7 as well. So I don't need to bet on Memphis in game 6, and I can just sort of sit back and watch and go, yeah, it'd be really nice if Memphis just closed this out and we cashed our series, our live series price and move on with our lives. The one thing I'll say about the Memphis point spread here is they've been 2.5 point favorites in these first 2 games on the road. Now they are just a 1 point favorite. So you are getting some theoretical value there, right? So, I mean, what has Minnesota done to have this point spread sort of dip? And the answer is obviously win a couple of games and be competitive in that game 5. But again, from a shot quality standpoint, 4 of the 5 games have been 90% plus, with 1 game being a 50-50 type of a game from a shot quality standpoint. So, again, we can't predict whether Memphis is actually going to make their shots because it was a 3-point and free throw debacle in the last game. One last thing. Anthony Edwards, right? Like looks, when he's healthy, it looks awesome, blah, 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 blah. But he's going for the steal on that last play to Ja Morant, right? And that's not something that you're going to see in the box score, right? Ja Morant's going to get credit for 2 points in the box score. and Anthony Edwards is going to sort of be let off the hook there statistically. That can't happen, right? Ja Morant can get the ball, outside the 3-point line, and you'll take your chances with, basically under 3 seconds left when he'd catch the ball. You take your chances with what happens there. Just
undisciplined, right?
Yeah. And the 3-pointer, like that's the stuff that's going to be on the highlight, right? Like Anthony Edwards hits the 3 to tie it, but then he gives it right back with that gamble. That's the discipline that you're talking about, right? And that's the thing that I'd be worried about with the T-Wolves if I was looking to back the T-Wolves in game 6 in a situation that, again, a series that feels like maybe it should go 7 based on how competitive it has been. That's the thing that I would be worried about when looking to bet in game 6 on the idea that it should go to 7 games.
Yeah, totally agree there. And a situation where Anthony Edwards asks to guard Ja Morant on that last play and then does that. It's like, wah, wah. But still a great series. And although I am on the Grizzlies to win and hope that they win, because obviously that's the pick, I wouldn't be mad at seeing a game 7 of this series because it's just been a lot of fun. Mavs Jazz. The Mavs lead the series 3-2. They won game 5 and covered their 3 points by winning 102-77. The Jazz at home in game 6 are favored by 1, and I'm going to be on the Mavs. It's just over Utah. Like, I think we talked about it as the series has gone along, and I just feel like it's a thing where the Mavs at every point, once Luka got back, they needed to figure out, okay, how do we now play against this team with Luka? And I know it's a home court, so I'm not saying they're going to blow them out because obviously 102-77, there's some home cooking in there. You're feeling good. You're up. You're whooping the crowd. Cool. But yeah, you're giving me a very short number there. It's basically a pick'em game. I'm going to pick the Mavs to win this game. I think it's just done. A hobbled Donovan Mitchell is not good at all. They can't play Mike Conley Jr. in this series because he's just, not doing well at all. And I'm being very polite.
Yeah.
And overall, just on the Mavs here. So give me the Mavs in that game.
Yeah, honestly, hard to argue. Of course, I'm still kicking myself for not just absolutely planting my flag in the Mavs from the start of this series. It never felt right to me that everybody was just kind of giving up here. And at least we got our world's easiest Dallas -3 win on, what was it, Tuesday night, Monday night. I can't even keep the day straight at this point. But moreover, as far as, this is betting content, we're trying to make people better. Like, the reason people are listening to this is, for lack of a better term, they can handle it, right? They can handle the conversation about the numbers and sort of the markets and all of that sort of thing. Otherwise, they would have given up on this a long time ago because it would have just been over their head and they would just be slamming the door saying, just give me the picks, you clowns. And so less about picks here. And listen, I haven't made a bet on this. I can sort of understand, and I would never bet the Jazz. Let me put it this way, because, Dallas certainly could have easily won both of the games that have been played in Utah. And obviously the health stuff has obviously turned a massive way for the Mavs with Luka coming back and Mitchell being injured. And this line opened with the Mitchell injury, thinking that, he might not be able to play. And it opened at Dallas -2.5. And then it's like, okay, well, he is going to be able to play, but to what extent, right? And this line has moved to -1, as you mentioned, for Utah. And so I'm just kind of obsessed with the lines in this series. I talked about it in the last show, and I just want to go over it one more time. So game 1 and 2, Utah were -5.5 point favorites, right? Dallas competitive in those games. They don't cover by a half point in the first game. They win the second game outright. So I'll ask, sort of put this to you, like, if there was a third game in Dallas, based on what we saw from those first 2 games, like, the point spread wouldn't have been 5.5, right? After Dallas won that game at home, right? It's got to be a couple of points less. I think it should, if game 3 was, again, weird situation where game 3 was another home game, it's got to be Utah -3-ish in that circumstance. But the game is in, obviously game 3 is in Utah, and we come back and Utah ends, closes -8, -8.5 without Luka. And you go, hang on a second here. -8 is just -5.5 in Dallas. That's a 2.5 point home court advantage flip in a situation where Utah has a pretty distinct home court advantage. Give them 3.5, maybe even 4. As we mentioned, same sort of deal with Boston. That should be a 7-point flip. And so I was sitting here, I should say, going, well, if it's 5.5 on the road, it's got to be like 11.5 to 12 at home. And of course, it wasn't. It wasn't even close to that. Dallas ends up winning, and they bring Luka back, and it was sort of Luka-ish in game 4, and the line goes down to 6. And you and I talked about it after on Monday. We're like, that doesn't make any sense, because if Luka's back, we made this massive adjustment in game 1 and 2 that Utah was going to be this 5.5 point favorite in a series that I think Dallas would have been, if Luka had been healthy, I think Dallas would have been a 3 to 3.5 point favorite in game 1, maybe even more. You go, well, if you're going to make a 9 point adjustment in the first 2 games, why are we only making a 2 point adjustment in game 4? Right. And so anybody sort of following along with this, teach a man to fish, so to speak, would have grabbed Dallas +6. Well, in game 5 rolls around, and Dallas, sure enough, we've shown that Luka is back, and now Dallas is -3 in that game, right? And we go, okay, like that's where it should have been the whole time, based on the idea that these two teams might be equal, which is a 9 point flip from where Utah was a -5.5 point favorite in that first game. So essentially, we've given 2 more points in favor of Luka's return, right? We're slowly getting back to like what Luka actually matters here to the point spread. And now it's game 6, Utah -1, which is a 4 point flip. Luka earning back sort of 3 more points on the market here. And that's 7.5 total, right? So essentially the market has told us over the course of these 6 games, as we've gone from Luka out to Luka maybe back to Luka sort of back to Luka back, and obviously, effective, that Luka's worth about 7.5 points. So game 1, based on that premise, right? If Luka was healthy, if it was going to be 5.5 points, okay, there's 5.5, get it back to Pick'em, another 1.5, another 2 points, whatever. That's saying to me that Dallas should have been in game 1 a 2 point favorite if Luka had been healthy, right? I just don't see how we get to 1.5 here, with Luka in the lineup, right? Like it still doesn't quite add up for me, especially when Donovan Mitchell is out. Now, I don't think Luka is worth 7.5 points, right? So I'm thinking if Utah wins this game, what's the line going to be in game 7? Because 3 is obviously too low. Everybody's going to hammer away on that. 4? Right? Like 4 seems like it's, a decent enough adjustment, especially if the Jazz win this game. You can't over adjust for Dallas after they've just lost to Utah. And so I think 5.5 points ends up being the correct number here for Luka, right? I think there was an over adjustment in those first 2 games. I think there was an under adjustment when he came back. And I think we end up landing on 5.5 points for Luka. And so if that's the case, I think we were right in those first 2 games that number was too inflated. Now, the problem was the outlier of that first game was the Jazz winning that game by 6, because again, they probably didn't deserve to cover that game. And then of course, Dallas won that second game. So then you factor in Donovan Mitchell, and that's the issue here where you go, okay, if Dallas was 2.5 point favorites on open, and now they're 1, you're telling me that Donovan Mitchell is a 3.5 point affect to the point spread. And I'm not there with that, right? Donovan Mitchell's not a good enough defensive player on his end, and he's not having the offensive series that I'm going to give him 3.5 points worth of credit here in the way that I'd be giving Luka 5.5. To say that Luka is only 2 points sort of more affecting on the point spread than Donovan Mitchell is crazy. So I think this is an over adjustment back to Utah here. I think you're right, man. I think Dallas has to be the play here on the money line at anything with a plus in front of it. I think that's the play here. Again, worst case scenario, you lose this bet and you get to come back on Dallas in game 7, a game that's going to be lined 3.5, 4 against a Jazz team I have no faith in winning a road game 7 in. Like, yeah, I think you got to get in here while the going's good here on Dallas, make the play. And again, you win this bet and the series is over, and we end up cashing those last 2 bets on Dallas and sort of save face from not piling in on Dallas before this series started the way that we probably should have.
Yeah, it's been a very interesting series to watch back and forth. And that's kind of just the reality of when you're trying to deal with these things and figure out, like, there's a number, but like the number is based off of like humans. So like,
yeah,
what's his ankle? How good is his ankle? Like you don't know until you actually play, right? So that's what makes this super interesting and super fun at the same time. But yeah, I'm definitely on the Mavs there in that one. One more game to go through here. The Suns and Pels. The Suns are up 3-2 in this series after they won game 5, 112-97. I was on the Pels. The Pels did not cover for me. We had the Suns. I think I said I had the Suns winning the game, but the Pels to cover at, I think it was +6.5. It was kind of spicy at the end, but not spicy enough for to kind of thread the needle on that one, as you like to say. Game 6 tonight, Suns -2. It's a short number, but I like to think the Pels win at home. I really would like to think that. I would like to think that the Pels force a game 7. But I'm not going to lie. I am making this -2 Suns pick just on the institution that is Chris Paul and Monty Williams and the organization that is the Phoenix Suns that are gonna like sense the urgency of not playing around with the game 7. Like I know it's tough, and I know the Phoenix Suns won. Like I know every single reason why the Suns just won that game at home, because Mikal Bridges and the other role players played really great at home. I get all of that. I'm acknowledging that I'm going counter to that, and I'm just making said bet based on the institution of Chris Paul.
Man, I was low key like fist pumping there because I really wanted your take on this, and I really wanted your take to bet the Pelicans. And so I look at this and
like I'm not saying that you shouldn't bet the Pelicans. That's not what I'm saying at all.
No, I know, and I know. I just thought you'd be sort of all in, as far, not all in necessarily, but like fired up about the Pelicans here. So first and foremost, right, like we just talked about the craziness and my obsession with the lines and the shifting and the valuations and all of that stuff, because that's the stuff that I'm really interested in. We talked about that with the Mavs and the Jazz, and you compare that to the sheer consistency of the point spreads of how it's supposed to work, right? It's supposed to be, all right, this team is this number when they play at home. This team is this number when they play at home, right? And you look at Phoenix, now it was -10 in the first game when they had Booker in those first couple of games. And then, of course, without Booker, it's 6.5, right? So quick logic, 3.5 points for Devin Booker, which, by the way, right, we start comparing to those previous two games, or two teams, I should say, where Luka 5.5. Okay, well, if Luka means 5.5, Booker means 3.5. That makes a ton of sense to me, because the Suns are at least, I shouldn't say at least capable, as I'm saying that the Mavericks aren't capable, because they obviously won without Luka a couple of times. But like the Suns have more, to handle teams with when Booker's not around. So 3.5 makes a ton of sense. I have no problem with that adjustment. Now you look at the road point spreads here, and it's what? -2.5, -2.5, -2. Consistent right across the board, right? Suns got one of them. Pels got one of them. So there's not really any reason to make a massive adjustment other than to shade it a little bit towards the Pelicans, just based on the idea that they have been, outside of the first half of the first game, very competitive in this series, right? Throw that out and, listen, we might have a closeout game for the Pelicans tonight, something along those lines, right? The Pelicans had that schedule loss that a lot of people talked about in game 1. And so I go, okay, I can understand why you'd want to take a half point off of the 2.5 here. And honestly, I don't think it's enough, because I think the Pelicans do win this game. I'm looking at this going, I'm trying to figure out whether I should be betting the Pels to win the series, whether I should roll over a money line parlay on this. Like the series price right now is +550 on the Pelicans, but obviously you get to a point where if a team needs to win consecutive games, whether it's 4, 3, 2, or whatever, that you can roll over the money lines. And so this game +110 on the Pels, and maybe a 210 in the next game if it's 5.5, 6.5, something along those lines. That equals about +550. So it doesn't really matter. Now, the key element here is, as we see this morning, Devin Booker on the mend, right? I don't think he's going to play in this game 6. That would be really, I think that 3-2, series lead allows them to save him for a game 7. So that's the reason I think I would use a money line rollover, because again, if Booker plays in game 7, the line's going to creep back closer to 10. Is it going to go all the way to 10? I don't think so. We're talking about a game 7. We were talking about a guy who's not exactly clean bill of health, assuming he comes back, but you're going to probably throw a couple of points their way, right? It's probably going to be closer to 8, 8.5, which means your money line is going to increase, which means your your money line rollover parlay is going to increase, above the plus 550 that's available right now. And by the way, if you bet the money line on the Pels and Booker comes back and you go, you know what, I just don't even really want the Pelicans anymore to win this series, then you just don't do anything, right? You just sit back and you watch and you don't have to do anything. So as much as I looked at plus 550 and was like, I could grab that right now, to me, the upside of that doesn't necessarily exist. There's only downside if Booker returns. So I'll be on the Pelicans on the money line here in this game, and I'll sort of play it by ear come game 7 if there is one.
Totally makes sense. And the Booker factor obviously plays a huge role in what could happen here. But I just find it very interesting. It's one of those things where, again, I know what the logic tells me, and I know when I'm going counter to that. So that's kind of when, I like to be upfront and let the peoples know, hey, this is where this pick is going, right? And to why the pick is going that way. So to recap the picks, there's a bunch of games on Thursday night. Raptors plus 1.5 in game 6 versus Philly. Give me the Suns -2 in game 6 in New Orleans. The Mavs +1 in game 6 in Utah. Moving on to Friday, got the Grizz at -1 in game 6 in Minnesota. And Sunday's game 1, Boston -5 in game 1 against the Milwaukee Bucks. Again, 3-4 from last week's pod, 22-15 play-in/playoffs. And then 34, 19-1 overall against the spread. Just giving those things out for the peoples who care. There's people who don't care, so don't listen. It's all good. We're here for everybody here. But at the same time, there's lots going on here in the world of betting, as there's also a very popular thing going on Thursday because it involves the NFL. And we know that the NFL is king. So what is going on there with you, my dude?
Yeah, and just to let people behind the curtain, right? We try to do a NFL draft specific podcast, but it's like a game of double dutch, man. Like, when do you hop in to record something that is going to sort of be the I don't want to say Bible or whatever, but like our guide to betting the NFL draft? Like, it's impossible to do because, something happens seemingly every day to shift the equation here, right? And so obviously it starts with the first pick overall, right? It's this 3-month process that we're trying to grab, bets and try to grab value. And this has been a really fun draft to try to handicap. Doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be profitable. Hopefully that's the case. And hopefully you followed my stuff over at The Score, because that's been the sort of venue where I can sort of populate, okay, 2 weeks ago, let's write about this. 10 days ago, let's write about that. A week ago, blah, blah, blah. Listen, I started writing about the draft back in January, trying to analyze, all right, what are the Jags going to do? This is before they even had a head coach, right? And we had the idea, okay, like they're going to hire an offensive coach here. They should be, who should then put a focus on drafting an offensive lineman for Trevor Lawrence. Like, that would make a ton of sense to me. And so what's happening here with the Jags is there's this internal struggle, right? And it's your guy, former 49ers general manager Trent Baalke, and Doug Peterson, obviously. And they're fighting about, okay, Peterson wants an offensive lineman, Baalke obviously wants a defensive end. And so the issue was, for me, and, call it experience, there's, no substitute for experience, and just seeing this market. And when Hutchinson would never really creep higher than -300 over the course of months and months, where we always see when it comes to the draft, the first pick ends up being 2 weeks, 3 weeks before, like -10,000, right? And it just never sort of made sense that, okay, Aiden Hutchinson is clearly sort of the number one from a branding standpoint, the sort of top prospect. But if that's the case, then why isn't he -10,000? Why haven't the Jaguars been trumpeting this guy the whole time? And the answer was, and it was pretty clear as day to me, it was Hutchinson's the most marketable guy. And if you wanted to trade down, you wanted to talk, I don't know, Detroit, who's right behind you, right? I think he's from like Dearborn, Michigan, obviously went to University of Michigan. If you're trying to sort of trick Detroit to move up one spot, a la like the Bears moving up to grab Mitch Trubisky a few years ago, where you go, okay, you're going to give us something to tell so that we don't take Hutchinson? Are you going to give us something that we don't take Hutchinson? Like, that's the sort of game that they were playing. Now, kudos to the Lions, whether it was information or stubbornness or whatever, they were like, no, we're not going to give you anything to take Hutchinson. We're going to dare you to pick Hutchinson. And over the last week, it's become pretty clear. And you see, again, speaking of reading the tea leaves and reading the market, meanwhile, you see another defensive end, another edge rusher, Trayvon Walker, slowly moving up the odds board, right? This guy was not even on the radar for number 1 pick overall back when I was writing about the draft in January. But you start to see him populate. He's like, okay, he's 10-1 now. Okay, he's 5-1 now. Well, why would he move up like that, right? The simple answer is because the Jaguars like him, right? And the information, while not rock solid, no one's coming out and saying anything, it's pretty clear that this horse is coming up on the outside here in Trayvon Walker. And it would make sense if an offensive lineman was sort of coming up on the outside in the way that we had Evan Neal as the favorite at one point. It would make sense of some other position, but we're talking an edge rusher, the same sort of position and skill set that Aiden Hutchinson has. And so when you see that, you go, okay, like there is smoke to that fire. And whether or not they end up picking Aiden Hutchinson, listen, they could still theoretically pick him. Though now we're looking at what, minus 400 for Walker. It seems like that's the done deal. But like, if the guy that everybody thinks is all these mock drafts, right? And everybody's got sources, right? And I always look at this and I go, yes, this is an information situation where if you see a line move day of the draft, like we are in today, like, yeah, I would make that bet relatively comfortably because we are on draft day. But 2 weeks ago, right? Any information is by and large just total BS. And these guys who have sources are being led astray for the purposes of the team. Those teams are trying to maneuver guys around. You've seen, maybe you've seen the article about Evan Neal's alleged injury issue that he has. Well, is that real? Or is that just one team hoping Evan Neal falls to them and leaked some sort of bunk information, right? Like that's the stuff that we're dealing with. And so you can just look at the market and sort of read all of this stuff, right? You can sort of see, okay, Hutchinson should, if he's this much of a lock with all these mock drafts, he should be better than a minus 300. So I think that has to be sort of made up. And then Walker ends up taking his place as the favorite. And then Hutchinson's still like plus 200, as if that makes any sense. Because if this internal like disagreement here or this debate about offensive line or defensive end exists, but we've already, if you're the Jags, ranked Walker ahead of Hutchinson should be like plus 5,000, right? He should be like 50-1 because they've already said we have Walker rated higher than Hutchinson. Not literally, but, obviously within the marketplace. Now, if they shift gears and they go, you know what, we want Ike Ekwonu because we do want to protect Trevor Lawrence here and he can play right tackle and we've extended Cam Robinson and that could theoretically be a strength to our team going forward. Okay. And I think that's an interesting element too here where you had Evan Neal and Ike Ekwonu both at like 15, 18-1 for the longest time. But what was sort of went under the radar is with that shift from Walker to go to first overall, Ike Ekwonu started to separate as well. He's in the plus 4, plus 500 range. And so he seemingly, based on what the sort of underground information would indicate, is that he's their selection as an offensive lineman. So he's the offensive lineman pick if they wanted to go that way, if Peterson ends up winning the argument, and Walker is the pick if Balke ends up winning the argument. Now, to me, logically, I would think that Peterson should win the argument. Trevor Lawrence is going to be way more important to their success than Trayvon Walker or Aiden Hutchinson ever would be. It's the Jags. Right. And you can bring in a guy like Peterson who's won a Super Bowl and maybe he's a really good coach and maybe he's a really good talent evaluator. Who knows? But it's very jaggy to bring that guy in and then not listen to him in favor of Trent Baalke, a guy who thought it was a good idea to bring Urban Meyer in as the head coach. And so the problem is, if it was logic based and all of that sort of thing, we would be cashing tickets with Ekwonu here. And I would be saying, hit Ekwonu plus 400, blah, blah, blah. I've got, Ekwonu tickets from 15-1 back when, again, I wasn't buying into this Hutchinson situation. The problem is, logic doesn't matter when you're dealing with some of these teams. And that's why the Jags are on back-to-back years of drafting first overall, which is actually like a really difficult thing to accomplish. And so, yeah, it looks like Walker's the play here. Don't go ahead and start piling in on minus 400. Obviously, things got a little late there. But again, if you've been following my stuff on the score, you would have seen over 1.5 for Hutchinson was a thing that I've been ringing the bell on here for a really long time. So we're in really good shape because that's now obviously, him to be over 1.5 is like minus 300, minus 400. It's starting to match the price of Walker. I wrote early on in the week when this happened that the best bet to jump on was Hutchinson at minus 110 to go second. That number is now close to minus 300, right? So there's different ways that you can play this draft based on the stuff that you know what's going to happen. Problem is, as we go down this order here, you get to 3 and the Texans. And again, if we're not able to rely on the Jags to do something logical to protect their, franchise quarterback, I don't know what the Texans are supposed to do that is going to be logical, right? And you're hearing some Derek Stingley stuff. He's made the big move here from in both the cornerback, first to cornerback to go market, which is one that we had success on last year with JC Horn. You've seen all kinds of crazy stuff as far as him moving into like the favorite position to be 3rd overall. And of course, his draft position total has plummeted down to 7.5, right? So it looks like he might be the play at number 3. But again, for the second straight year, it looks like 3, when it comes to draft day, is going to be the position where we just don't know what's going to happen. And of course, that's going to set up the rest of the draft, a draft that's really interesting because of how many teams have 2 picks in this draft. So normally we can go, okay, the San Francisco 49ers, like blah, 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 they pick 8th. Like that is sort of the dead end. Like this player is going to go to that spot type of thing. And you can sort of cap around that. You can't do that because the Giants have 5 and 7. Are they going to play it like fantasy football? So, for example, if Trayvon Walker goes number 1, Hutchinson number 2, and maybe a cornerback goes number 3 to Houston, I think the Jets are going to grab a defensive player, whether that's Sauce Gardner or Kayvon Thibodeau. Then you get to the Giants, who want an offensive lineman. They are absolutely going to select an offensive lineman in this draft. But you know how it works in fantasy, right? Like if you're sitting there and you have a pick at the back end of a round, and maybe it's back-to-back picks, or maybe you've got a pick and somebody else has back-to-back picks. But you know that they're not going to take a quarterback, for example, because they just took a quarterback. You know that you don't need to take a quarterback with your first pick. You can wait and take a quarterback when when your turn comes around in the next round. So you can grab something that maybe those guys like. So the Giants, why would they grab an offensive lineman at 5 if there's going to be between 2 and 3 guys available to them? Do they really think Evan Neal is better than Charles Cross, or Cross better than Neal, or Cross better than Ekwonu, right? Does it really matter to them if they can grab somebody of impact at 5 that maybe Carolina wants at 6? Problem is, nobody has a clue what Carolina is going to do either. Up until recently, Kenny Pickett was the favorite to be picked by Carolina. There's no chance Kenny Pickett is going to get picked by Carolina at 6. This guy's draft position number is 18.5. And he's supposed to be the favorite to get picked by Carolina, but it's because nobody has any idea what they're going to do. So it's like, I don't know, Kenny Pickett as the favorite, maybe, sure. And maybe they end up getting Kenny Pickett because they trade out of that, which, by the way, is more reason for the Giants to pick somebody sort of skill position guys, whatever. And so I think the Giants wait to 7 to take their offensive lineman. And so I think there's a bunch of different options that are really heavy underdogs at 5 that you can start picking, mixing and matching. Maybe the Giants like Jamison Williams. That's a pretty big underdog at the 5th overall pick. What if they like any of those wide receivers? They've obviously, people have heard that they're trying to trade Kadarius Toney. That would mean that they'd be in the market for a wide receiver, for example. Yeah. So I just think that there's a bunch of different ways, and it's very interesting. And there's a ton of plus money type things here, but the plus money type stuff at this point, when it's a 50-50 type of thing, you don't want the plus money, right? This isn't a value thing where you and I come on and we say, listen, I think these teams are dead even. If I'm getting I'm getting points with this team, if I'm getting plus 3.5 points, I'm going to take the points. This isn't to take the points situation, because if a thing is an underdog in a 50-50 situation here, it is for a reason. That's why we make these bets 3-4 weeks ago. If something's a plus underdog when there's 10 different options, well, then that means that there's maybe some betting opportunity there, right? And you just have to figure out which guy or which set of guys is, something that you want to play. One thing that I looked at was the 9 spot in this draft. I think that's a really good spot for a wide receiver to get taken. Why? Because Seattle wants to trade out. There's a bunch of these teams, not that surprisingly, that have needs of basically infinity, right? Like, what do the Seattle Seahawks need? Everything. What do they not need? A wide receiver. Well, at 9, there's probably going to be 2 to 3 of the top wide receivers available. We have seen the market for wide receivers being ridiculous in what Tyreek Hill got, Devontae Adams got, go on down the line here. What Deebo Samuel is trying to get, by the way. And so the Jets are sitting there and they don't have a premier wide receiver. They're sitting there at 10. And they might trade that to the 49ers. We've heard that. Well, I'd love to get your take on the Deebo Samuel situation at some point. But they might trade that to the 49ers for Deebo Samuel, at which point would you be surprised if the 49ers drafted a wide receiver? I certainly wouldn't, right? Like that makes a lot of sort of economic sense for the 49ers to do, right? You get a cost-effective wide receiver plus some other stuff from the Jets. I think that's a very reasonable thing to do. If you see that, whether or not it's the 49ers in that spot or the Jets in that spot, if you're a team, wouldn't you want to trade up to 9 with the Seahawks to make sure that you grab the wide receiver that you want? And so there's a ton of wide receivers, the Williams, the Drake Londons, the Garrett Wilsons, that are all in the double digits to go in the 9th overall pick. And so you can use those 3 guys and sort of splash them all together, a little sprinkle around a unit to end up getting to a 4-1, 5-1 type of bet that a wide receiver goes to the 9th overall pick, not Seattle specifically, right? Because the reason those guys are such underdogs at this point is because the only thing Seattle has right now anyway are wide receivers. But if it's not Seattle picking, all of a sudden wide receivers become a lot more valuable in that spot. So the further you go down, the crazier it gets. And again, anytime, you can sort of grab something at an underdog price that, again, isn't a 50-50 type thing, you want to do it the further down the draft because you want more crazy stuff to potentially happen. When it gets to the end of the draft, there's a handful of guys, again, I've wrote about who I like to maybe get in the first round. But at this point, the bet that's still available out there is over 15.5 defensive players to go in the first round. I think that's going to be a coveted, obviously side of the ball, but certain positions, secondary, edge rusher, et cetera, are going to be guys that are getting reached for at the end of the first round. The thing to remember at the first round, the difference between the first round and the second round, right, is that you get a 5th year. You get that team option for a 5th year. So you want guys at high expense positions because you can keep cost certainty at that position. Look at like edge rusher or cornerback, right? You get to 4 years, you got to pay for a really good corner. You got to pay for a really good defensive end. You got to pay for a really good wide receiver now. You don't really have to pay for a middle linebacker. You don't really have to pay for a running back. You don't really have to pay for a safety. So why would you bother grabbing one of those players at the end of the first round, knowing that even if they're a good player after 4 years, it's not going to be that expensive. Right. Whereas like a defensive end, if that guy's balling, if a wide receiver is balling after 4 years, you get to use their, the team option for that 5th year and save that money that we have seen is getting thrown around on guys like Christian Kirk at this point in time. Right. And if you can save a year of having to pay the Christian Kirks of the world, you absolutely do it. So when you're making your bets about the first round and stuff that's happening at the end of the first round, keep in mind positional scarcity, positional value, because it all comes down to the salary cap and how you're chopping up your pie. And so to me, that's the way to play it. And then as far as the quarterbacks is concerned, it's funny. It's the NFL draft, and I haven't mentioned a quarterback at this point other than the Kenny Pickett not going to Carolina situation. I think Malik Willis, somebody is eventually going to reach for me. Malik Willis, I did take a little under 13.5 on him. I have him first quarterback taken. I have him at plus money from earlier on. If you're able to grab the minus 150s that were out earlier on the week, hopefully you were able to do that. There's just no reason to reach for Pickett. He doesn't have the upside. And the further we get away from actual college football being played, the less actual college football matters. And so in college football, our guy, Kenny Pickett, man, we thought he could win the Heisman. I think he actually went to New York, right? I think he got the invite to New York. Doesn't matter, man. People want upside, whether it's NBA draft or NFL draft, and Malik Willis provides that upside. There are a ton of different teams, long shotty type teams that could pick Willis. My favorite one, well, my 2 favorite ones, one, I think the Saints, there's a reason they have 2 picks, that they went out of their way to get 2 picks in the first round so that they can move up. Do they move to 6? Do they move to 8? Do they move to 9? You know what I mean? There's a bunch of different ways that they can move up to go and grab their quarterback of the future if they're not fully bought in on Jameis Winston for the next 5 years. The other one, Tampa Bay is like 38-1 to get Malik Willis. if there was ever a team that could sort of use, as they say, a luxury first round pick, it's a team that had to spend a couple of weeks of their lives thinking about life after Tom Brady and looking around at the roster and going, we have everything on this roster by and large, except a quarterback of the future. That might be a team you can sort of mortgage the future a little bit by putting some picks together along with their first round pick to hop up and grab Malik Willis if he ends up sliding right now. He's 13 and a half, I think is his number. So they'd have to obviously throw some future stuff into the mix. But when you're talking about future stuff, maybe quarterback of the future is the play. Otherwise, I think the Bucs were not tank necessarily, but we're going to probably be really bad with Kyle Trask or Blaine Gabbert, whoever is going to be quarterback for the Bucs. And the quarterback draft next year is looking pretty loaded, right? You got your Bryce Youngs, your CJ Strouds, et cetera, et cetera. But now that Tom's back, and they're never going to tell Tom not to show up. Now that Tom's back, it's like, well, let's just go for this year. And the roster is pretty, loaded. They don't need anything necessarily here. They didn't really play Tryon Shoyinka last year, their first round pick from last year. Why not? Why not take a shot here and have a project type of a quarterback here? So, and we're talking about a 38-1. So when I say it's fun, it usually means it's going to lose, but we might have a fun sweat if Willis starts to drop and crazy stuff starts to happen in this NFL draft, as it always does.
Yeah, NFL draft, always a great time of year, of course. Same for the NBA playoffs. Lots of stuff happening, lots of stuff for us to continue to talk about down the line, and we will do so. So thanks a lot for jumping on, my dude.
Thanks as always, my friend.
Then if you want to follow me online, you can do so on Instagram at Sheldon Alexander and on Twitter at Shell Alexander. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the DRF Sports Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also rate us, review us, like us, all that other fun stuff. But for more from this new project from DRF Sports, just a little reminder. If you're unfamiliar with the letters DRF, it stands for Daily Racing Forum, which has been around for over 100 years, giving you all of the horse racing information, data, and analysis. But now we've taken over the entire sports world. So if you want coverage on every football game, as well as the NBA, MLB, college sports, and more, head to drf.com/sports for all of the details and insights, as the site has all of the data on every game, including offensive and defensive stats, betting angles, line movements, key injuries, team stats, and more. The DRF data is what powers our power trends. So if you want to see which trends our analysts have selected, follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. If you want access to all of the raw data, drf.com/sports. That's where you can find the usual previews as we deep dive into the games. And of course, we got you covered on this podcast. However you want your betting information, we've got you covered. Again, my name is Sheldon Alexander. That's all I got for now. But until next time, see ya.
Thanks for listening to the DRF Sports Podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show. For more sports betting advice, go to drf.com/sports and follow on Twitter at DRF_sports.